first cold winds of December swept through the neighborhood, carrying with them a familiar sense of anticipation. Families were pulling out storage boxes, stringing up lights, and preparing their homes for the holiday season. For many, this was the best time of the year, a chance to turn quiet suburban streets into glowing pathways of color, laughter, and warmth. Among these families was Mark and his wife, who lived at the end of Maplewood Lane. Their house, though modest, always carried a sense of charm when the holiday season arrived. Mark had grown up in a household where Christmas lights weren't just decoration, they were tradition. He remembered as a child standing in awe of the bright displays. Around his old neighborhood, the glowing reds and greens, the twinkling whites, the snowmen and reindeer. Now, as an adult, he wanted to create that same magic for his own family and neighbors. So, on the first weekend of December, Mark climbed the ladder, checked each strand of bulbs, and carefully wrapped his home in a cascade of shimmering lights. His display wasn't over the top. It wasn't a light show that synced with music or a spectacle visible from the highway. But it was festive, cheerful, and undeniably beautiful. Warm white lights outlined the roofline, red and green bulbs ran along the fence, and a glowing reindeer stood proudly in the front yard. At night, the house radiated with holiday spirit, bringing smiles to passers-by and making children stop in their tracks. For a brief moment, everything seemed perfect, but lurking behind that perfection was the shadow of the Homeowners Association, and more specifically, its chairperson Karen had earned her reputation in the neighborhood not just as the HOA chair, but as a woman who believed she was the guardian of order. To her, rules were not guidelines, they were gospel. She patrolled the community with sharp eyes, hunting for violations no one else noticed or cared about. Grass half an inch too long, she'd send a notice. Trash bins left out 10 minutes past pickup, a fine would follow. To most residents, she wasn't a leader, she was a tyrant in a cardigan. And this year, Karen had decided the holiday lights would be her battlefield. 3 days after Mark finished decorating, a crisp white envelope appeared in his mailbox. The HOA's official letterhead stared back at him like a warning label. Inside, he found a violation notice. Your holiday lighting display is non-compliant with community standards. Please remove the decorations immediately, or face a $250 fine. Mark blinked in disbelief. Non-compliant. What could possibly be wrong? He reread the HOA guidelines. Nowhere did it mention color restrictions. Nowhere did it ban reindeer figures or twinkling bulbs. His lights weren't flashing obnoxiously, nor did they extend beyond his property line. They were, by all reasonable measures, harmless. Still, the letter was clear. Failure to comply meant escalating fines. Mark tried to brush it off at first. Maybe it was a mistake. Maybe Karen or whoever sent the notice was being overly cautious. But the unease settled in his chest. His wife frowned as she read the letter, worried about what this could mean. Their children, excited about the lights, couldn't understand why the grown-ups suddenly looked so serious. The next evening, Mark decided to ignore the notice. He turned the lights on anyway, letting the house glow as it had before. Neighbors walking by complimented the display. Some even admitted it was the nicest they'd seen so far that year. Their smiles reassured him that he wasn't out of line. But Karen wasn't done. 2 days later, another envelope arrived. This time, the fine had already been applied, $250 for the alleged violation. The letter warned of further fines if the decorations weren't removed immediately. Along with the notice, a bold sentence stood out. Your display violates the HOA's policy of maintaining uniformity and aesthetic harmony. Uniformity and harmony. Those words struck Mark as absurd. Across the neighborhood, houses were decorated in different ways. Some had inflatable Santas, others had rainbow-colored icicles, and one family had even installed a giant projector showing dancing snowflakes on their garage door. None of them had been fined. Why was his home singled out? It didn't take long for the answer to surface. At the next HOA meeting, which Mark reluctantly attended, Karen made it clear. She stood at the front of the clubhouse, clutching her binder of rules, her tone sharp and authoritative. She spoke of how certain holiday displays disrupted the visual consistency of the community and how residents needed to respect standards. But as she spoke, Mark noticed something strange. Photographs of his house were projected on the screen, circled in red like a crime scene. Not one other decorated home was mentioned. The bias was undeniable. Mark raised his concerns, calmly pointing out the inconsistencies and asking why other decorated homes hadn't received notices. Karen brushed him off with a dismissive smile, claiming his lights were more intrusive than others. When he pressed further, she shut him down, saying, "The matter wasn't open for debate." The meeting ended, but Mark left with a fire burning inside him. This wasn't about harmony. This was about control. Karen had decided his home would be her example, and she wasn't going to back down, but neither was Mark. As he returned home that night, passing his glowing lights that now felt like a target, rather than a decoration, he realized something. If Karen wanted a war over holiday cheer, then a war was exactly what she was going to get. And so, with tension building and neighbors beginning to notice the unfair treatment, the holiday lights, war had officially begun. The days that followed the HOA meeting carried an unshakable tension. What was once a cheerful display of holiday spirit now felt like a quiet act of rebellion. Each evening, when Mark plugged in the lights, it wasn't just about bringing joy to his family anymore. It was about defiance. His glowing reindeer and carefully strung bulbs had transformed into a symbol, silently standing against Karen's overreach. Neighbors noticed. Some waved at him from the sidewalk, whispering their support. Others stopped by to compliment the lights, often lowering their voices as if afraid Karen might overhear. There was an unspoken agreement forming in the neighborhood. This wasn't just about holiday decorations anymore. It was about fairness, and everyone knew it. But Karen, perched in her position of authority, wasn't one to back down. If anything, the defiance only fueled her resolve. To her, every evening Mark lit up his house was another challenge to her control, and Karen wasn't about to lose face in her carefully curated kingdom. The escalation came sooner than Mark expected. It was a quiet Thursday evening when it happened. Mark had just returned from work, exhausted but determined. He plugged in the extension cord, and once again the house lit up in warm brilliance. He stood for a moment, admiring the glow, when he heard a sharp, deliberate sound from the side of his yard. At first, he thought it was the wind rattling something loose, but then the lights flickered once, twice, and went dark. Confused, he rushed around the side of the house, only to find the extension cord lying severed on the ground. And there she was, Karen, dressed in her ever-present cardigan, holding a pair of pruning shears in her hand as if she'd just done routine yard work. Karen didn't even bother to hide her actions. Her face carried the smugness of someone who believed they were untouchable. Mark froze in shock, the weight of the moment sinking in. She hadn't just sent letters or imposed fines this time. She had trespassed onto his property and physically cut his lights. It wasn't a notice. It wasn't a meeting. It was sabotage. The violation wasn't just against his decorations. It was against his home, his family, and his right to celebrate. Karen, unfazed by his presence, muttered something about enforcing compliance before walking away as if she had done nothing wrong. She left the severed cord behind, a physical reminder of her intrusion. Mark stood there, fists clenched, his heart racing. This wasn't about decorations anymore. This was about principle, about power, and about a line that Karen had just crossed. Word spread quickly. Neighbors who had already been skeptical of Karen's leadership now had a story that confirmed their worst suspicions. They whispered among themselves, some angry, some fearful. A few even admitted they had their own run-ins with Karen, smaller incidents they had never dared to speak about. The cut cord became more than just damaged property, became evidence. Mark documented everything. He took photos of the severed cord, wrote down the exact time, and recounted the incident in detail. He knew that Karen's arrogance would only grow if he didn't take a stand. But he also knew she wouldn't expect him to fight back. For too long, neighbors had simply accepted her dominance, paying their fines and avoiding confrontation. But Mark wasn't going to be another silent victim. That night, as he sat in his living room with his family, he realized they were at a turning point. His wife's face carried the same frustration he felt, and his children, though confused, understood that something unfair had happened. They asked why someone would cut their lights, why a holiday tradition could make someone so angry. And Mark had no good answer, only the certainty that it wasn't right, so he made a decision. The next morning, he filed a police report. Trespassing, property damage, interference. He handed over the photos and explained the incident. The officer listened carefully, nodding as if he had heard similar HOA stories before. Though the wheels of justice turned slowly, the act of filing the report was powerful. It wasn't just about holding Karen accountable, it was about setting a boundary that she had no right to cross. But Karen wasn't worried. In her mind, she was untouchable. The HOA board was her shield, and the vague rules she twisted to her will gave her power. She likely believed Mark's police report would go nowhere, that it would dissolve into bureaucratic nothingness. And perhaps on its own, it might have. But what Karen didn't anticipate was the reaction of the community. One by one, neighbors began to rally behind Mark. Some came forward with stories of their own fines for harmless decorations, warnings for minor infractions, and instances where Karen had bent the rules in her favor. Others simply offered support, dropping by to ask how they could help. The more people spoke, the clearer the pattern became. Karen wasn't protecting the community, she was controlling it. The spark that had started with a severed extension cord was growing into something larger, something unstoppable, and yet, Mark knew this was only the beginning. Karen wasn't the type to back down quietly. If she had escalated to cutting cords, there was no telling what she might do next, so he prepared. He bought new lights, heavier duty extension cords, and even a small camera to keep watch over his yard. He wasn't going to let her bully him into silence. If Karen wanted a war, then she would have won. As he stood outside that evening, plugging in his new setup, the house once again glowed in defiance. The lights were brighter than ever, casting a warm glow across the neighborhood. Children laughed, families smiled, and for a brief moment, everything felt right again. But deep down, Mark knew the battle was far from over, because Karen wasn't done on. Her next move would shake the neighborhood to its core. The brightness of Mark's renewed lights stretched across the cul-de-sac like a quiet challenge. It wasn't just about decoration anymore. It was about standing firm against a woman who had, for too long, mistaken her HOA title for absolute power. And though Karen dismissed his persistence as petty, the rest of the neighborhood was beginning to see something they hadn't before. An alternative to silence. The first ripple came when the Smiths, who lived 2 doors down, dusted off their old box of decorations. For years, they had kept their holiday cheer boxed up in the attic after Karen had fined them for hanging a simple wreath that was too large for their front door. But now, inspired by Mark's boldness, they put it back up. The wreath wasn't extravagant, but its red bow gleamed under the porch light like a small act of rebellion. Soon after, the Patel family joined in. They had been cautious homeowners, careful never to attract attention. But when they saw Karen strut down the street, glaring at Mark's home with its glowing lights, they quietly draped strands of colored bulbs along their front porch. Each tiny flicker sent a message Corin's grip on the community was loosening by the end of the week. Nearly a third of the houses on the street had some form of decoration. It wasn't coordinated, it wasn't loud, but it was unified. Karen, once feared, was being resisted. But Karen wasn't about to let go of her authority. She called an emergency board meeting, summoning her allies with the urgency of a general preparing for battle. Behind closed doors in the HOA's clubhouse, she unleashed her fury. Non-compliant decorations, she argued. Disorder, chaos. She painted Mark and his supporters as agitators. Residents who were bringing down property values and disrespecting the rules. And for a moment, she seemed convincing. After all, she had been running the HOA for years, her influence seeping into every bylaw and committee decision. But cracks were starting to show. Even within the board, there were whispers of concern. Some questioned why Karen had cut Mark's cord, why she had escalated the issue into something personal. One board member quietly pointed out that the bylaws were outdated, vague, and inconsistently enforced. Another admitted they had received multiple complaints about Karen's heavy-handedness. Karen dismissed these voices, her pride too great to consider compromise. She doubled down, drafting letters threatening heavier fines and promising further enforcement for violators. To her, the holiday lights had become more than decorations. They were a direct threat to her, crown of authority. The neighborhood received those letters with a mix of frustration and disbelief. Threats of fines for harmless holiday joy seemed petty at best, tyrannical at worst. More people began to talk openly in driveways, at mailboxes, during evening walks. The conversations were no longer hushed, and then the hypocrisy was exposed. One evening, as neighbors strolled through the subdivision, someone noticed Karen's backyard glowing faintly. Curiosity turned to shock as they realized Karen herself had put up decorations, twinkling white lights strung neatly along her back patio, visible from the cul-de-sac behind hers. They weren't extravagant, but they were there, and they were undeniably non-compliant according to her own interpretation of the rules. The discovery spread like wildfire. Photos circulated quietly among neighbors, and the whispers turned into full conversations. Karen had cut Mark's cord, fined residents, and issued threats, all while enjoying her own forbidden display. The double standard was undeniable. Mark was among the last to see the photos. A neighbor slipped him the evidence, their voice carrying a mix of satisfaction and disbelief. He studied the images carefully, his frustration hardening into resolve. It wasn't just about his lights anymore. It was about truth, about fairness. and about exposing the reality of Karen's rule. The next HOA meeting was already scheduled for the following week, and anticipation buzzed through the community. For once, residents weren't dreading it, they were preparing for it. People who had never attended before were planning to show up. Their grievances, sharpened by years of quiet frustration and now fueled by the blatant hypocrisy. Mark didn't plan to storm the meeting or shout. He knew he didn't need to. The evidence spoke for itself, and the voices of his neighbors would carry more weight than any single outburst. But Karen, unaware of the storm gathering against her, strutted through the neighborhood with the confidence of someone who still believed she was untouchable. To her, the glow of her backyard lights was invisible, hidden, private, and beyond reproach. She had no idea how visible her actions had become. The stage was set. The neighborhood was no longer divided between Karen and her silent subjects. It was divided between truth and hypocrisy, between fairness and control, and as the day of the meeting drew closer, one thing became clear. The holiday lights had sparked more than a seasonal dispute. They had sparked a reckoning. The clubhouse, usually a place of muted chatter and half-empty folding chairs, was brimming that night. Residents who had rarely bothered to show up filed in, some carrying printouts, others whispering to one another in sharp, hushed tones. The buzz in the air was unlike anything the neighborhood had felt before. For the first time, the community had come together, not for a potluck or yard sale, but for something heavier, justice. At the front, Karen presided, as she always did, standing tall with her papers neatly stacked and her gavel resting nearby. She welcomed the attendees with her usual clipped tone, though her eyes flicked nervously toward the unusually large crowd. She wasn't used to so many people paying attention. For years, she had run these meetings with barely enough residents to make quorum. But tonight, the room was full. Karen began with her agenda. She spoke of bylaws, of order, of how holiday decorations were spiraling out of control. She referenced property values and neighborhood standards, carefully painting herself as the guardian of the community's best interests. Her words were rehearsed, her cadence sharp. For anyone who didn't know better, she might have sounded reasonable, but the neighbors did know better now. It started with a single hand raised in the back. A quiet voice asked why, if decorations were truly so damaging. Karen herself had strung up lights in her backyard. The question hit the room like a spark to dry tinder. Heads turned, murmurs rose, and Karen's confident expression faltered. Karen tried to dismiss it as a misunderstanding, claiming that her backyard lights were temporary and compliant. But by then, several residents had already pulled out their phones. The photos glowed from their screens. Karen's patio, lined with the very decorations she had. Condemned, the whispers became sharper. Double standard, hypocrite. Words floated through the crowd, heavier than any fine. Mark sat quietly among them, watching. He hadn't come to argue or to gloat. He simply let the voices of his neighbors fill the room. This wasn't his battle anymore, it was theirs. More questions followed, each one cutting deeper. Why were some residents fined while others were overlooked? Why were rules enforced only when Karen found it convenient? Why had she taken matters into her own hands by cutting Mark's extension cord instead of following due process? Defenses crumbled under the weight of the questions. Her answers grew sharper, her voice rising, her composure cracking. For years she had ruled with fear, but tonight the fear was gone, replaced by resolve, by indignation, by unity. Then came the turning point. One of the board members, usually a silent ally of Karen, cleared his throat and spoke up. He admitted that the board had grown uncomfortable with her methods, that her actions had not been formally approved, and that many of the fines were questionable at best. His statement wasn't fiery, it was measured, calm, but it carried the weight of truth. The room erupted. For the first time, residents realized they weren't powerless. The bylaws that Karen had wielded like a weapon could also be a shield. The board wasn't her personal army. It was accountable to the community, and the community was speaking now, loudly and clearly. Karen pounded her gavel, demanding order, but the sound, once intimidating, now rang hollow. She barked about decorum, about procedure, but no one was cowed. The balance of power had shifted. Mark finally rose, not to shout, but to steady the storm. He spoke simply, reminding everyone why they had come. It wasn't just about holiday lights, it was about fairness, about living in a neighborhood where joy wasn't fined, where rules weren't twisted to fit the whims of one person. His words weren't long, but they didn't need to be. The nods around the room showed they had already been felt in the hearts of his neighbors. The board, caught between Karen's authority and the community's outrage, announced they would conduct a formal review. It was a diplomatic way of saying what everyone already knew: Karen's grip was slipping. Karen's face tightened, her confidence reduced to a brittle mask. She ended the meeting abruptly, claiming she would not tolerate insubordination. But the words rang with desperation, not strength. She left the clubhouse to a crowd no longer intimidated by her absence of warmth, but emboldened by their newfound unity. As residents spilled into the cool night, the cul-de-sac buzzed with something more powerful than holiday cheer hope. They spoke openly about revising bylaws, about electing new leadership, about taking back the association that was supposed to serve them, not rule them. Mark lingered behind, the glow of satisfaction faint but steady. He hadn't wanted a war, only a chance to celebrate the season. But what had begun with a strand of lights had illuminated something much larger, and though Karen had left in anger, everyone knew this wasn't over. The board's review loomed. Karen would not go quietly, and the fight for fairness, though awakened, had only just begun. Karen did not sleep that night. Her reputation, carefully constructed over years of chairing the HOA, had taken a direct hit. For the first time, she had lost control of a meeting, lost the narrative, and perhaps worst of all, lost the fear that had kept her neighbors silent. She sat in her kitchen long after midnight, nursing a lukewarm cup of tea, scrolling furiously through the HOA bylaws. Somewhere in the fine print, she told herself there had to be a weapon. By morning, her plan had crystallized. If the community wanted to rally against her, then she would remind them of her authority. She began with letter stacks of them. Citations for trash cans left out too long, notices for lawns an inch too high, warnings for mailboxes that didn't meet aesthetic standards. Residents who had spoken out most loudly at the meeting were the first to find envelopes taped to their doors. The message was clear. Karen wasn't backing down. At first, some neighbors wavered. Old habits of compliance tugged at their resolve. But Mark and a few others reminded them of the bigger picture. The fines weren't about holiday lights anymore. They were about intimidation. And the more Karen lashed out, the more transparent her motives became. Still, Karen had one more card to play. She filed an official complaint with the city, claiming that Mark's decorations posed a fire hazard. She worded the report carefully, using bureaucratic language to mask her vendetta. A week later, a city inspector arrived at Mark's home. Clipboard in hand, the inspector walked the property, jotting notes as Karen hovered nearby, smug and self-assured. But her satisfaction faltered when the inspection concluded. Mark's lights were found to be entirely safe and compliant. No violation, no hazard, no grounds for removal. Karen's attempt to escalate the battle had backfired spectacularly. Word spread quickly. The neighbors who had once whispered in private now laughed openly at Karen's desperation. The inspector's visit was the talk of the block, and it further exposed the pettiness of her campaign. But Karen wasn't finished. She tried to rally the remaining board members, insisting they back her up or risk losing control of the neighborhood. She accused them of disloyalty, of being weak. But the more she pressed, the more they recoiled. They had seen the community's anger firsthand, and aligning with Karen now seemed like political suicide. Behind closed doors, discussions began. Petitions were circulated quietly, signatures gathered discreetly. The bylaws Karen had once used to enforce her will contained provisions for her own removal, though she had never imagined anyone would dare use them. But the neighbors had found their courage, and they were prepared to use every clause, every technicality, every ounce of collective will to see her gone. Karen sensed the tide turning, and her behavior grew more erratic. She patrolled the neighborhood late at night, taking photos of decorations, scribbling down license plate numbers of guests who parked on the street, sending angry emails filled with capital letters and exclamation marks. What had once been a cold, calculated dominance had devolved into frantic paranoia. Mark, meanwhile, stayed steady. He decorated modestly, refusing to let Karen's aggression rob him of the season's joy. He spoke calmly at small gatherings, encouraging patience and unity. His quiet resilience contrasted starkly with Karen's unraveling, and the neighborhood noticed. Then came the moment that sealed Karen's fate. One evening, she attempted to cut another resident's decorations, this time a modest set of lights, strung around a front porch. But the resident had installed a small security camera. The footage, crystal clear, captured Karen sneaking onto private property with scissors in hand. When the video made its way through the neighborhood, there was no denying what she had done. Even her most reluctant supporters could not defend. The act, trespassing, vandalism, and blatant abuse of power all caught on tape. The community had endured her fines, her hypocrisy, her intimidation. But this was too far. Petitions turned into action. A special meeting was scheduled. The board, under immense pressure, agreed to hold a vote of no confidence. The clubhouse, once again, filled with residents. Only this time, there was no nervousness, no hesitancy. The people were ready. Karen walked into the room with her usual stack of papers, but the weight of them seemed heavier than ever. Her eyes darted from face to face, but she found no allies, no approving nods, no submissive silence. Only a wall of resolve. The gavel that once symbolized her authority now sat untouched. The vote was swift, decisive, and final. Karen was removed as HOA chair. For the first time in years, the neighborhood exhaled. Relief washed over them like fresh snow. Mark didn't cheer or gloat. He simply watched, knowing that what had begun with a strand of holiday lights had revealed something greater. The power of community when united against unfairness. But though Karen's reign had ended, the story was not yet complete. Because in the quiet aftermath, as residents celebrated their victory, questions lingered. What would happen next? Would Karen disappear quietly, or would she find one last way to stir the embers of conflict? The season of lights wasn't over. and neither was the tale of the woman who had tried to extinguish them. Karen's removal as HOA chair should have been the end of it. For most people, it would have been a graceful exit, a quiet resignation, perhaps even a chance to rebuild bridges. But Karen was not most people in the days that followed her ousting. She retreated behind her front door. The once pristine lawn that had been the symbol of her pride began to show neglect. Curtains stayed drawn, lights off, driveway empty. For the neighbors, it was as if a storm had passed, leaving behind an uneasy calm. They wanted to believe the conflict was over, yet a lingering unease clung to the air. Karen's silence felt less like surrender and more like plotting. The board moved quickly to repair the damage. Fines issued under Karen's leadership were reviewed and, in many cases, dismissed. Residents who had felt targeted were offered apologies. And for the first time in years, the HOA felt like what it was always supposed to be, a group of neighbors working for the good of the community. Not one person's control, but Karen's shadow loomed. Whispers circulated about her behavior. Phone calls to city offices, long conversations with lawyers, muttered complaints overheard at the grocery store. Some neighbors dismissed it as bitterness, the last sparks of someone who couldn't accept defeat. Others weren't so sure it was Mark who noticed the first real sign. One morning, walking his dog, he saw Karen's car parked outside the clubhouse. No meeting was scheduled, no event planned. She was sitting in the driver's seat, staring at the building. When she noticed him, she started the engine and drove off without a word. Mark told a few neighbors, and soon the unease grew again. What was she planning? Would she attempt to overturn the vote, sue the board, retaliate in some new, unexpected way? As the questions swirled, the holidays crept closer. Despite the tension, residents pressed on with their traditions. Houses glowed with strings of lights, wreaths adorned doors, inflatable snowmen guarded front lawns. The neighborhood, once cowed by Karen's rules, now shone brighter than ever before. Mark kept his own display modest yet meaningful, a tree wrapped in multicolored lights, a nativity scene glowing softly, and a banner that read, "Community is the brightest light." To him, it wasn't about winning against Karen anymore. It was about reminding everyone what they had fought for. Then, on a cold December evening, just days before Christmas, Karen made her move. Neighbors awoke to find several homes vandalized. Extension cords cut, decorations toppled, ornaments shattered across driveways. It was clear this wasn't random mischief. The precision of the damage, the focus on houses with the boldest displays, bore Karen's fingerprints. But what she hadn't realized was that the neighborhood was watching now. Security cameras, once rare, had multiplied after her last stunt. This time, there was no doubt. Footage from multiple angles showed her, cloaked in darkness, scissors in hand. Moving from yard to yard like a shadow, the evidence spread like wildfire. By morning, the entire community had seen it. Police were called. Karen was questioned. And though the charges were minor trespassing, vandalism, the humiliation was enormous. The woman who had spent years lecturing others on rules and compliance was now branded the violator. Her legacy, built on control and intimidation, collapsed under the weight of her own actions. The neighborhood responded not with anger, but with unity. They came together that evening, stringing lights higher and brighter than ever before. What had been separate displays merged into one continuous glow, stretching from one end of the street to the other. It was no longer just holiday decorations. It was a statement Mark watched from his porch as families worked side by side, laughing, hammering, untangling cords, refusing to let Karen's bitterness dim their celebration. For the first time, the block felt alive, vibrant, connected. And when the last strand was plugged in, the street erupted in light so dazzling it seemed to challenge the winter night itself. Windows lit up with warm glows, roofs sparkled, and trees shimmered. It was a festival, a defiant beacon. Karen's house, dark and silent, stood in stark contrast. Where once she had dictated how others lived, now she sat alone in the shadows of her own making, watching as the community flourished without her. That night, the neighborhood held a gathering in the cul-de-sac. Hot cocoa was passed around, carols were sung, and children ran beneath the canopy of lights. The board made a simple announcement. From that day forward, holiday decorations would be celebrated, not restricted. The bylaws would be updated to reflect it. Mark didn't take credit, though many thanked him. He knew the victory belonged not to one person, but to everyone who had stood up, spoken out, and refused to be silenced. As he looked around at the joy on his neighbors' faces, he realized the true lesson. Karen had tried to control through fear, but unity had proved stronger. She had tried to extinguish the lights, but together they had created something brighter than ever before. The war of holiday lights was over. The community had won not just their right to decorate, but their sense of belonging, of ownership, of home. And though Karen remained bitter and isolated, the neighborhood moved on. The season would end, but the memory of that glow, that unity, would last long after the lights were packed away, for years to come. They would remember that one December when a strand of lights became a symbol, when neighbors became allies, and when a community finally found its voice. The final illumination wasn't just the glow of bulbs and wires. It was the light of people who refused to be dimmed.